Should I have a drink? Is that a time
Yeah.
for a little?
We for sure need a beer break.
A little bit of a sip.
Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. I'm very excited today because I have Cori Alonso-Yoder with me, who's Associate Professor of the Fundamentals of Lawyering at GW Law School and somewhat of an immigration lawyer expert. So, Cori, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, Emily.
We have a lot to discuss, specifically all about what's going on surrounding immigration in this country. Trump is coming out the gates swinging, and immigration is one of his first punching bags. So before we begin, what beer are we drinking?
Well, I am drinking a Modelo Especial Tall Boy. As long as the tariffs remain not in place, I'm going to go to my classic Mexican beer.
Perfect. And I'm also drinking a Mexican beer. I'm drinking a Pacifico. So cheers.
Cheers.
All right.
Salud.
Salud. Okay. My favorite question I always love to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say? Why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
So I have been a lawyer in the immigration space for a number of years. I've taught now at 4 different law schools, and I teach students how to be good lawyers, especially when working on issues related to things that are difficult and are challenging, and immigration is certainly among them. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation about how today differs from 2 weeks ago.
A lot has been going on it's been 10 days, even though it's felt like 10 years. Let's dive into it. What's going on? I mean, we've been seeing a lot of ICE raids. People are very scared. A significant increase in action. Would love to just kind of hear the breakdown, the rundown about what's been going on.
Yeah, so some of the most recent stuff has happened is actually something that we hadn't really necessarily expected to see, which was the signing of immigration legislation just very recently to the tune of bipartisan commitments to legislation in what is known as the Lake and Riley Act, an effort to even further criminalize immigrants and to criminalize them even when they've been suspected of a crime or arrested for a crime, which is pretty sweeping. So that is some of the most recent, the kind of change on the ground in the legal landscape. But of course, all of this is preceding the earliest efforts by the Trump administration, not even just in the last 10 days or so of the administration, but also the kind of earlier iteration of the Trump administration and all of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that came out of that. So what we have right now is kind of rhetoric that is supported by the presidential power. So executive orders, of course, being the clearest example of that. And a flurry of executive orders to the tune of about a dozen have come out that have some impact on immigration and are certainly signaling a message moving forward from the administration. Of course, immigration being a signature issue of the Trump political platform, and certainly of the way in which the Trump administration has governed and clearly intends to govern moving forward.
So what are some of the big pieces of executive orders that you think are important to call out? What do they say?
Yeah, so the ones that I think people are paying attention to and that they should be doing so rightly is, of course, the executive orders purporting to end birthright citizenship. Of course, that is plainly unconstitutional, and executive orders are not legislation, and they're certainly not constitutional amendments. So I think there is clearly a view to in the administration that this will moving to litigation, and so the order to end birthright citizenship and to end any sort of a extension of passports or other federal issued government documentation, so that folks who cannot prove that they were born after a certain period of time, the order has a 30-day window, but has already been put on hold by a federal judge. So that, I think, is rightfully on people's radar, and something that is certainly from a legal perspective just totally out there in terms of its legality. But it's should be taken seriously. I mean, it's going to impact on a lot of people's sort of sense of their own belonging within the United States, and that's not for nothing. That's a very major major change for people's sense of their own identity and their own ability to kind of be in this country and integrated more fully. So that is huge. Of course, some of the other things that the Trump administration has sought to do really are to continue to build on the concept of immigrants as being dangerous, as being a threat to health and safety of people in the United States. And there, we saw a number of executive orders that express exactly that narrative. So, executive orders securing the border, purporting to end the quote unquote invasion of the United States, likening immigrants to terrorists and killers. And so all of that rhetoric is very much permeating this dozen or so executive orders. And then we just have the kind of off the wall bonkers things like renaming the Gulf of
Oh my
Mexico,
God.
right? So like that's not directly related
So
to
dumb.
it is more of the messaging, right? And
Right.
Trump both as a private citizen and as a elected official has been all about branding and messaging. So um, those sorts of things, which just it ranges, from everything from taking people's basic citizenship rights and then converting them into undocumented, which is pretty ironic, a stance for a president who wants to end undocumented immigration or unauthorized immigration to
Right.
in one fell swoop convert babies into undocumented immigrants is a pretty bold stance, but it ranges from something so severe as to something so potentially lackadaisical as changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America.
Yeah. So I guess another big question is like, obviously, a lot of this is done for show and it comes swinging out of the gate. What is, but this, a lot of, I believe almost all of this was happening right during Biden as well, and this is not something that's new. I think, extent of it is new and the amount of press behind it, I think, is new. But, and the numbers might be new, but the actions being taken are not new for the most part. What are the differences that we're seeing?
Yeah. So, and that's an important point. It can even be stated that some of this goes back to the Obama administration and sort of Obama's distinction as being the deporter in chief of having deported the most under his administration. And I think some of that blueprint, that groundwork and infrastructure was, ripe for Trump to take advantage of in that first Trump administration. But yeah, I think there was a lot of the underlying restriction on immigration under the Biden administration, while at the same time there were efforts to try to address root causes of migration, and those were showing some level of success, some kind of partnerships and engagement with our kind of allies in Latin America to address questions related to the kind of push and pull factors of migration and the push factors that were leading folks to leave their home countries in at least that region of the world. So I think that is an important thing that has ended, right? So that kind of cooperation between governments is certainly not the path that the Trump administration is staking out for itself. So that has certainly changed. But the point is there, which is that the Biden administration certainly was not lenient, much to the contrary narrative that the Trump administration is advancing, that the Biden administration essentially allowed for or fostered or encouraged this kind of influx of immigrants into the United States that's just not borne out in the facts. It's not borne out in the law, and it's not borne out in the policies of the Biden administration. But there were things that the Biden administration was doing that would actually be sort of helpful, net positive in terms of protecting immigrants, including protections for those who'd been exploited in exploitative labor situations. And so one of the main main goals of these new Trump executive orders is really to undo all Biden executive action, including some of those policies and processes that were actually in somewhat favorable to immigrants.
Right. I know immediately when Trump took office, CBP 1 was canceled. So there was no ability for migrants to come in legally and try to get an asylum claim, right? Which just like immediately cut all of that.
Right.
Um, but I've been seeing a lot of also ICE raids are significantly increasing, and apparently there's now quotas for daily, like I think 1,700, maybe 1,200, arrests per day, which is a huge amount, huge. And the Trump administration had originally ran on saying they were only going to really target people that committed crimes. And I remember having a very distinct conversation with someone who was originally from Mexico, who was here and has their papers, right? But was voted for Trump. And he was like, they're only going to come after the people that, you know, like have committed crimes. I'm like, that's not what's going to happen. Right. And so, what extent of this initial, literally, I'm going to say immigration roundup, because that is what it is actually people who have committed crimes and are violent offenders, which, by the way, for the record, very, very minimal amount, and is actually just people who came in here trying to find a better life.
Yeah. So, I mean, Trump keeps banding about the kind of very grossly expanded numbers of people who are in the country undocumented. I think most experts point to it, and it is hard to ascertain because it is a shadow population, but most folks kind of agree around 11 million people. And that is a number that hasn't changed over the decades and administrations, right? So it seems like this number of people the Trump administration is trying to target, again, just a huge enforcement effort to be able to address that number of folks. And as you rightfully point out, it's a small number. It's compared to the native-born population, in fact, a smaller number who are engaged in sort of criminality or who are implicated in the criminal legal system. So this idea that Trump is going only after criminals, what they've essentially done in these EOs is to really paint anybody who's in the United States without authorization as a criminal, sort of per se. And so people are being rounded up, and there are what's called a collateral catch. So there is authority that ICE has when they have a judicially executed warrant for a certain individual to kind of question the people in their surroundings. And those people, if they don't have documentation that satisfies an immigration officer of ICE that they are in the country lawfully, they could find themselves being detained. And we've seen incidents of that, anecdotes of folks who are U.S. citizens being detained in these kind of raids and collateral catch because ICE feels emboldened to really do a searching inquiry of the folks around a person who may be targeted for removal. And again, the person who's targeted for removal may or may not have a criminal record. It's clear that that's been a priority for removal from administration to administration. So to the extent that things do not necessarily change, what hasn't changed is this kind of targeting of criminals, but what has changed is this broad strokes painting of people who are in the country as all criminals, which is quite different.
Yeah, for sure. It's crazy to see. I keep sipping my beer because the more you keep talking, I'm like, oh God. I was like, it's just so upsetting and bad. Well, I guess this leads to the next question, right? Of basically what Trump has instructed ICE to do is kind of do an immigration stop and frisk is the way that I would try to describe it. Anyone who may look undocumented or who look like an immigrant, which is just code for racism, might be detained. And there have been a lot of, like you said, instances of people who are legal citizens being detained, especially also a lot of native-born populations, which has been a really interesting, I think, effect of this. What do you think we're going to see legally coming out of these types of things? And how do you think that the Trump government is going to be challenged from doing this?
Yeah, well, we already see immigrant advocates. We have the ACLU filing, complaints and being successful in those complaints and getting some temporary relief in the birthright citizenship executive order blocking. But of course, individuals who are impacted, folks who are finding themselves in immigration detention when not only have they been here their whole lives, but they are from people who are indigenous to this country, to this land. So you're going to see a flurry of litigation, and it's clear that the executive orders are kind of prompting that litigation. It's clear that the executive orders are intended to be a trigger for litigation, which has the impact of course, being drawn out, very long processes. And it also kind of leads to this perfection of their defective executive orders in a way that we saw, I think most clearly in the initial Muslim ban, the kind of Trump 1.0 effort to stop people at the ports of entry, at the airports, who are coming from Muslim majority countries. And essentially, the courts gave the Trump administration a few different opportunities to improve their executive order to kind of pass a legal muster. So it seems like at the kind of peak, of course, at this, any incoming president is going to be at the peak of his power at the beginning of his administration. And it seems like Trump is using that political capital to start these kind of litigation loops that are going to go on for a long time. And not only will individuals and immigrants' rights organizations, but we see a very clear standoff that is again shaping up between the states and the federal government. And that will be really interesting because I think the courts, and namely the Supreme Court, seem to be particularly swayed by concepts of the states being encroached upon by the federal government. So I think that will be something to watch and very interesting. At the same time that more recently, the Supreme Court has sort of suggested that states don't have the same kind of standing as an individual who is impacted by federal immigration policy.
Interesting. That's a very interesting perspective because it's hard to imagine the Supreme Court at the moment really kind of not disagreeing with Trump in a way, but the whole state perspective, right? I think will be very interesting to see kind of where it lies and how it benefits Trump and how it doesn't. I guess my next question would be, I would love to talk about the militarization of the border. And there has been a significant increase in troops that have been sent, but it's not like unheard of. There's already a significant amount of National Guardsmen. And on my previous podcast, went through that executive order of about allowing all of these, really militarizing the border, right? And how that's desensitizing us to having a significant military power around and a militarized government that can be taken action on its own people and the concerns surrounding that. How are the increase of troops that have been sent to the border different from what has been going on previously?
So it is a flavor of the same militarization of the border, the same, and in prior efforts at immigration kind of policy and reform, there has been, I think, going back to at least Ronald Reagan, this kind of concept of the stick and the carrot, right? And so the stick in immigration has always traditionally been, okay, well, we're going to get really tough on enforcement, right? We're really going to secure the border. And then once the border is secured, we will roll out some sort of a legalization program or some sort of a pathway to citizenship. That second part's gone away, right? It's just become in these past administrations and in past Congresses, this idea of continued enforcement and continue to kind of have a punitive immigration system. So that kind of trend has existed. But what has not existed is this kind of continuing to have a border that is legally growing. So like we now have border policies that extend borders 100 miles into the interior of the United States, which really grabs a lot more people than what we think about at just being sort of Texas, California, Arizona, the kind of, southwest border region. Many more people live in what is legally construed as the border than perhaps realize. And the rights and protections within that border zone are limited, are lessened than within the interior of the United States. So this idea of kind of the mass movement and the amassment of troops at these borders isn't something that just affects the southwest border, that just affects a handful of those states, but it really has implications for the entire country. And I think you're onto something in this idea of the kind of desensitization of what it means to kind of be under kind of a military occupation through this the construing of our immigration system or our immigration policy as one of being to prevent invasion, to empower our military. And the executive orders, call for this level of cooperation between what we now have, our new secretaries of Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security. So, Pete Hegseth will be working with 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 DHS, newly appointed DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, to work in concert to have our borders, again, very loosely construed, to have this kind of military presence, which means that the United States a good part of the United States will be potentially under military occupation.
Right.
Should I have a drink? Is that a time for a little?
We for sure need a beer break.
A little bit of a sip.
Yeah, super dark. And goes into kind of just the continued destruction of rights and civility that we're seeing. And, there was a flight sent to Brazil, I believe, the other day, where all of the people that were being sent from the US back to Brazil were all handcuffed on a plane without air conditioning, and people were not allowed to go to the bathroom. There was no water, like a significant dehumanization, right? That is so dangerous. And, and then Trump also just announcing Guantanamo Bay being reopened, even though it still kind of exists, but being reopened on a massive capacity to create a facility that's going to house 30,000 immigrants. This stuff has been going on for a really long time, and every single administration has done deportation and is, in some way. But the dehumanization that comes from Trump is such a unique and dangerous element that is just very, very scary and upsetting to me, which is, yeah.
Yeah. There was a kind of a policy of felons, not families, and this idea that a good number of people who are here, which is the reality, are here to kind of make a better life for themselves and their families, and to try to live, with their heads down and take care of themselves and their families, which is, by the way, the people that you are seeing and encountering on the day to day, and who make up the vast majority of that 11 million, a number which has only kind of increased because of our immigration policies that, again, have increasingly militarized a border region that had been, for hundreds of years prior, a kind of place where people could come and go, and had at one point been, in fact, part of another country, Mexico, before the United States expanded and through war and conquest took that part of the world. So I think this idea of continuing to label people as dangerous and as felons and to dehumanize them, the kind of treatment of people as cargo, going back to Brazil, and the rightful outrage from the countries who are seeing their nationals treated in this way, I think is pretty stark. And you see it, the dehumanization, I think, is particularly, to me, notable in the work that I've done over 20 years doing immigration work. Asylees and refugees were always seen as the good immigrants, right? Like the people that we want to come. But part of what the executive orders have done, and what the Trump administration's policy has been, is to limit those numbers. Even you have the kind of libertarian Cato Institute decrying that Christian refugees are no longer welcome in the United States under Trump policies and efforts to reduce refugee resettlement. So it's just pretty. It's pretty different, I think, in terms of the way that this administration sees the kind of immigration policy that works, whereas many folks have, for generations, kind of looked at it as legal immigration good, illegal immigration bad. Essentially, I think that the Trump administration has found a way somehow to paint essentially all immigration on some level as bad and as illegal on some way I can't even quite wrap my head around.
Right. I mean, and this brings me to my next question, which is all the dialogue being we support immigration as long as it's done legally, right? But the system is broken, and it takes a really long time. If you could provide some insight into how, before Trump, legal, immigration worked and the asylum process worked, and what were the windfalls with that'd be fantastic if you could explain.
Yeah, well, and this is the thing that's a little bit of a head scratcher, because the underlying laws have not changed, and those are still the laws that are in place. Executive orders can't displace, duly enacted congressional enactments signed by former presidents. So um, the existing laws are still there, and there's just been a differentiation in the way that people are kind of processed, especially on the asylum, grounds, to prevent people from kind of entering into the United States, which would traditionally have allowed them, and which legally does allow people to seek asylum in the United States. So all of the underlying law is there, but there's just been interpretations and there's just been programs and policies put into place, such as Remain in Mexico, right? The CBP1 app, even though it's ended, it was never a champion for asylum seekers to be able to use that app and queue up and be able to enter in the United States in that way. So I think one of the kind of aspects that is particularly confusing here is, and will be interesting to see, is at what point does Congress sort of stand up and say, you are interpreting these laws in a way that is not consistent to our purposes? Of course, you would hope that would go to the Supreme Court, and that the Supreme Court would find that, taking away birthright citizenship, a central premise of our entire body of immigration law, is totally inconsistent with the Immigration and Nationality Act. So I think one of the things that'll be interesting to see, especially at this time when we have the kind of alignment of the Congress and president all being within the Republican Party, is, do we see more legislation that kind of achieves the policy priorities of the Trump administration? Um, so right now, the way that immigration law works is there are very limited pathways to be able to enter into the United States lawfully, and they're all subject to limitations and restrictions in terms of their eligibility criteria and or the number of individuals who are allowed to immigrate under a certain category each year. So that is all created by Congress. That is all still in place. And because of the restrictions, both in terms of eligibility and in terms of the kind of backlogs and waiting lists that you find, you see people who are trying to do things the legal way and are, in some cases in line for decades to come lawfully. And then you have people, of course, who were never intended to get into a line because they're experiencing hardship in the form of persecution. And so we have programs and policies in place that are intended to allow for the lawful immigration of folks like refugees or asylum seekers, but again, that are just being circumvented through these efforts to use immigration law to basically categorize refugees as being detrimental to the health and wellness of the United States. So that has been, I think, a very, very different approach, and it certainly seems that this broken immigration system doesn't have any clear way forward in terms of getting a kind of bipartisan solution from the ground up. And because of that lack of movement, I think that these EOs and administration policy has been allowed to be sort of so back and forth, and to be so drastic and so radical in the way that we're seeing that the executive orders propose.
As we're talking about it, right? And it's all undocumented, undocumented, undocumented. I'm not sure I actually know exactly what undocumented means. What does it mean to be undocumented?
Yeah, so undocumented is essentially this concept that a person is not legally authorized to be in the United States. But the undocumented, that title or that label really essentializes a group that has all different manner of experiences and ways in which they've come to the United States, or in ways in which they find themselves to be without documentation. Um, so you have the kind of classic example people think of someone who has sort of surreptitiously entered into the United States, perhaps over the U.S.-Mexico border. That is a person who we would call a person who entered without inspection. We, in immigration parlance, we use EWI, EWI, entry without inspection. But then that's not the majority of people who are undocumented. The majority of people who are undocumented were documented at some point, which I think just speaks to kind of the lack of available pathways for remaining in the United States. So the majority of folks who are undocumented had come on some initial authorized entry, whether it was as a tourist or as a student or in a work visa. again, the kind of variety of categories that exist for people to come on a temporary basis to the United States, which, even as I say, are a variety, doesn't mean that there's a lot of opportunities to come. But it just means that there have people who've been able to make an initial inspected entry and be authorized for a period of time, and then overstay that period of time. And then there are people who, potentially find themselves again as asylum seekers, refugees who may not have the protection of their home countries. They are stateless. And depending on if they feel that they can assert their legal protections under asylum, um, could be eligible, but I think they would rightfully and reasonably see what's happening and perhaps decide to go further underground instead of to present themselves in order to achieve the humanitarian protection that in theory our laws extend, but that in practice and in the continuing sort of march towards eliminating asylum and humanitarian protections seems to be a dwindling hope for safety in the United States.
Right. Thank you for the explainer.
Yeah.
It's like you get so caught up in all the words that people are using, and it's just to throw around all these buzzwords that you don't actually take a moment to understand the nuances of it.
Yeah. I mean, and people maybe they would be maybe documented in their home countries, right? I think it's just this larger question of the United States does not recognize certain individuals as being lawfully here and thus does not extend them kind of the protection of documents. And even that's not true, right? Like there's a lot of states that offer driver's licenses, IDs, the like for folks regardless of their immigration status if they're residing in a certain area.
Interesting. Well, I guess this also then comes down to kind of like the final, category and issue to be discussed is the economic impact, right? Immigrants are such a vital part of America's economy and do such important foundational work. What would be the economic impact if Trump is able to deport every person who is here on undocumented basis?
Well, every economic study that looks at this has, I would say, at least the plurality, if not the majority, of economic indicators is that having immigrants in the country is a net positive, and that there are deep economic benefits to having a welcoming policy towards allowing migration into the United States. So all of the food that we depend upon, like I hope you like to eat, because
It's one of my favorite activities.
it is such a good thing to do. That is very much dependent on from farm to table. That is an industry that is entirely dependent on immigrant labor, from the pickers and the harvesters, to people who are working in the restaurant industry, the people who are doing this kind of service work. So that would suffer immensely. And there's already discussions and in some of the, DHS confirmation hearings in the Senate, this idea of, how do for USDA, what's going to happen for farmers? What would happen to, American farmers if they no longer are able to kind of operate in a way that they have immigrant labor, that they have folks, be it folks who are undocumented, be it folks who are coming on temporary visas, which is a major category as well. How are you going to assure the American farmer? And some of the conversations that have come out of that from the Trump administration is that we're going to give them welfare, right? Like, suddenly we're fans of that. So, I think it's just so fascinating to see a policy that is so divorced really from the broad economic interests of the United States. And so if you're not questioning what's going on from sort of a humanitarian kind of basic human decency perspective, I think you should be deeply troubled by the economic effects, especially at a time when, the country is still trying to rebound from this post-pandemic economy, the kind of concerns around inflation. I know so much is being said in the social media about the eggs and the price of the eggs and why do we care about these eggs, and these eggs are so important.
Bird flu. It's bird flu. That's why. Okay. Anyways, sorry. It drives me up a wall. Okay.
But people are like, I'm going to vote for eggs, right? I'm over, my own economic interest over the basic and deep, basic humanity of others. I think you're going to find yourself to be sorely disappointed if indeed if indeed the Trump administration does manage to affect in the way that it has set itself out to do these kinds of mass deportations and disruptions, I do think there maybe is potentially there is clearly an intended consequence, even if substantively people are not removed, of forcing people deeper and deeper underground and creating much more of a shadow economy, much more of a shadow labor force, in fact, that is ripe to exploitation, right? So I think that either way, they feel that they've achieved something that is laudable, which is either that people are going to continue to be exploited in, suboptimal working conditions, or that they leave. And I guess we'll see if really, if the dog catches that car on that one and what happens, right? Like I think the economics and the economic impacts would be staggering.
I mean, for all the people that feel some type of way, remember when it was right after COVID and people wanted to go out to eat and there wasn't enough staff and people were really upset about having to wait. It's going to get way worse if Trump has his way. I'm just putting it out there, people.
Right. Well, and you might remember that a lot of the people who were deemed essential were immigrant workers in protein processing plants, right? That were in like very unsafe conditions without being exposed to, what was still is a very serious still is a very serious disease, but at the time we had no vaccines, we didn't understand how it was transmitted, and these were the people on the front lines making sure that there was food available in the kind of American larger economic mechanism. So I think just being mindful of like what does that actually look like, it would be quite a drastic change from the way people live their lives today.
Right. Cori, thank you so much. Is there anything else you would like to touch on?
Well, I want to thank you. I wish that this conversation could have been a little bit more bright and cheery, but I'm glad that we at least have our light pilsners
I know.
To
It
have a
helps
little
a lot.
effervescence in this conversation.
It certainly helps.
But I just want to, tell people that part of the effort here is really to demoralize and is really to cause fear. And there's every reason validly why people should be feeling that. But I also just want folks to understand that there is a lot of hope with all of this. I think that we'll see people standing up, I think, for what is right. I teach in a law school, and in the first Trump administration, we saw what we called the Trump bump, right? Like more people wanting to go and defend the rights of folks who are otherwise being maligned and mistreated. So I think that we have to keep our eyes open for that kind of a hopeful approach, and still be calling out the craziness, the quackery where we see it.
Absolutely. I think that's a really nice silver lining to end on. And my friendly reminder for all people who feel conflicted, 99.9999% of the people that are trying to come to this country are doing so because they just care about their family and want a better life for them. And if you were in the same position, you would try to do the same thing, So treat people with humanity and dignity and respect, and try to have some empathy and compassion.
Hear, hear.
So, Cori, thank you so much for being on this. I really appreciate it. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.